We broadcasted shortwave radio
when they turned their hot water tap on, they would get the sound of the radio
Africa,
coming out of their
South
faucet,
America, Central America.
which I think is amazing.
The sounds were not necessarily clear, but they were clearly voices.
Les canaux d'irrigation que les Acadiens ont construits.
I can tell you that some of the supply voltages are on the order of 14,000 volts.
When I told him that I was dreaming in another language that I didn't know.
Les ondes courtes de Radio-Canada couvrent la moitié du globe.
And here I am on the other side of the world, connected.
Well, it was quite exciting. This was the first tower that went up was for CBA, and it was I think 480 feet. They broadcast almost all over the world. Well, it was kind of a fun place to work. There was always music, and whatever program was on, you heard it. I'm 98 years old. I went to work for the CBC in 1946, and I married one of the operators in 1950. And I know he came home one day with an RF burn on his hand because he was doing something out at one of the switch boxes out underneath the towers. So it was hazardous. One of the things that you had to do when you were acting as a guide to take people through the plant was to hold a fluorescent light in front of the transmitter and it would light up. So that just went to show what the radiation was. It was interesting that so many of them died of cancer, whether it was brought on by radiation from the transmitter. Who's to know? There was a farm opposite the radio station, and I often wondered how these people, if they were exposed to the radiation as well. But I don't know about the cows, if they kept on giving milk that wasn't radioactive.
The site at Sackville was chosen because of the ground characteristics for shortwave broadcast. The salt marsh created an excellent place to broadcast from, and we broadcast to a number of locations around the world. The primary locations were in Africa. When it was first set up, the site, we broadcast to Germany, to Asia, and after a period of time, we started broadcasting to the US, to Central America, to South America. And I think for a period of time in the past, we broadcast to Australia. Basically, we could broadcast anywhere we wanted to the world just by selecting the antenna and the amount of power and the frequency that we used.
I lived in Kuala Lumpur for a year, and Kuala Lumpur is exactly on the opposite side of the world from where I was living at the time, which was in Calgary. So 12 hours away. So when I would get up 6 o'clock in the morning in Kuala Lumpur, turn on my shortwave radio to CBC, and here's my old friend Bob Oxley reading the 6 p.m. news, 6 a.m. for me in Southeast Asia, 6 p.m. in Canada, and the marvel of feeling that I was there on the other side of the world. And I had this strange feeling of, I got my arms around this world. I know what things are going on here, and there was just a sense of some amazing connection with CBC, back to Canada, and with the marvel of being so far away and yet feeling so close to what was still going on here. I just get a little warm spot in my chest as I think of that experience in that time.
Mais c'est surtout les nouvelles internationales, hein, c'est les nouvelles du Canada à travers le monde, pour montrer aux auditeurs qu'est-ce qui se passe au Canada. Quelle sorte de culture on a? Où est-ce qu'on se tient au niveau de l'international? Et de notre réputation dans les différentes nations du monde et ainsi de suite. On veut faire connaître par les ondes courtes le Canada tel qu'il est.
Oh, I used to listen to the shortwave radios when I was a little boy. My father was in the military, and we were out posted in Germany, Baden-Baden. And I remember as a little boy, my parents would turn on shortwave radio and listen to the news and stuff like that from Canada, and the hockey game and stuff like that, and the scores or what have you. And when I was in the military, we used to listen to shortwave radio as well. And so it was always a way of catching up on what's happening back home, and listen to news, even if you're out in the middle of a bush and there's no way of catching a television signal or anything like that remotely similar, or no internet.
Everybody can afford shortwave. We only got, 30%, 40% of our world that's on computers?
There's a lot of remote areas and a lot of poor areas in the world that, they don't have internet up there. They don't have computers. They can't plug into a tree. But a shortwave radio, especially the wind-up ones, those were ingenious. I mean, they were like a $20 radio. You get this thing, you crank, wind it up, and then suddenly you're connected to the planet.
You can buy a shortwave radio at Radio Shack, and it was the size of a pack of cigarettes, and you can put it in your pocket and take it with you wherever you go. And so, even though you can't get an FM or AM radio station anywhere near you, you can always listen to shortwave and find out what's going on,
Shortwave's not something you can block. It's not like, on the internet where you can control news in your own country. Shortwave radio, if you got a radio, you can pick it up. No way to block it.
I was up in the North Pole for 6 months, but being up north, you always seem to be able to pick up somebody's transmission in shortwave. So you was able to listen to different broadcasts from different countries and stuff like that. Depends who was telling the news and who was involved. If it was an outside country and they were just reporting the news that something happened, they would tell it as it is. They just say, this is what happened, this is what we saw, this is what witnesses' accounts were, and so forth. If a country was involved and they had to broadcast the news, they would always filter the news to eliminate certain content that might make them look in a bad light. So it was interesting sometimes listening to the same news story from two different points of view, because one will say something and the other one won't.
I guess just after the end of World War II, the Cold War going on, so I guess it was important that they be able to cover Europe and North Africa with its programs.
C'est au-delà de la programmation canadienne qui était émise par Radio-Canada International. On utilisait la puissance de ces tours-là. Je pense aussi que c'est plus documenté par rapport à Radio Libre Europe qu'on l'émettait. Et c'était un des seuls endroits au monde, effectivement, où on était capable d'envoyer ce signal-là pour qu'il puisse dépasser le mur de fer et pouvait se rendre sans se faire embrouiller, en fait, par les gouvernements sous l'égide du régime communiste. Et donc, les gens du côté de l'Est pouvaient entendre la programmation de Radio Libre Europe. Donc, les gens sont convaincus que ça joue un rôle dans la sensibilisation des gens aux droits et libertés, aux droits fondamentaux auxquels ils n'avaient plus le droit dans le régime totalitaire.
The salt content in the marshes acts like a ground plane, and what the ground plane does is makes the antennas look as if they're twice as tall, almost as if there was an invisible antenna buried in the ground.
Well, the salt in the ground that was over many hundreds of years, the tide bringing it in, because it is a tidal zone, we got salt water into the ground. It created a ground plane in and of itself that the shortwave power basically launched itself off of this ground wave. When, just as an analogy, if you will, an ordinary AM site that you listen to in your car, when they build a site, they build a tower, but around the tower they put radials, copper wire in the ground to create this ground plane. In a salt marsh condition like we were in Sackville, this was already there due to the salt, so it was there for us, and we could take advantage of that without having to bury ground cables to create this ground plane underneath the towers.
A lot of times you can get sweetgrass out in the marshes too, right? Because sweetgrass grows in saltwater marshes, and that's a saltwater basin that comes up both sides.
There's sweetgrass all over here, and we use that because in our ceremonies, that is a braid of Mother Earth. We pick it and we braid it. The 6th district, Sigadie, is from here to Cape Tormentine. That is, of course, that's our hunting areas and our camping grounds. This was a hunting area, and not another thing. It was a habitat for the Mi'kmaq and also for Fort Beauséjour. Now, Fort Beauséjour had the natives on their side, and then the English were on the other side. They were at Fort Lawrence. That's all native land. Our sustenance for life was there. Our fishing was there. Our hunting in that area there, I imagine a long time ago, right there where the tower was, you probably couldn't sleep at night because it was loaded with, before they put the dikes and stuff there, with waterfowl.
When the water comes up in, because it wraps in this way, and of course it wraps in around the towers too, and then a lot of people fish, all the way in around it, and they also get what they call like marsh greens. It's a vegetable that they can get. They harvest it right along that little river too. You'll see them parked alongside the highway, and they'll be harvesting this little green.
Je vois l'évolution de l'humain. Je vois au-devant donc les marais que les Acadiens ont endigués pour leur subsistance, qui était à l'époque, l'agriculture était leur subsistance, et on en voit les tracés dans les marais qui restent. Et ces antennes qui sont peut-être pas la subsistance, mais qui sont la réalité d'après-guerre, donc la réalité qu'on a voulu développer de la communication pour assurer que le Canada et les intérêts du Canada et la culture du Canada soient reconnus mondialement. Et aussi, j'imagine, pour une question sécuritaire, aussi, les antennes ont été installées aussi pour assurer une sécurité au niveau pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. J'imagine, c'était important d'avoir un réseau de communication, de diffusion d'informations.
My experience with the radio waves begins with a dream that I was having one night. It wasn't an abnormal dream, but it had a sort of heightened reality to it. It was such an intense dream that I searched night after night for another type of dream like this, because I thought maybe I was evolving into another state of mind, or something I ate that day. So I tried to remember what I ate that day, little things like that, how much water I had, or if I was at a dehydrated point. It was an ongoing scientific study that I carried out for a while, and a while most likely being 2 to 3 days. Now, this sort of intense dream didn't occur until probably about, or more specifically, about 13 to 14 days later, at which point it was during an afternoon nap instead of a nighttime sort of dream. So it was a different state. I wasn't in my bed. I was comfortable, but sort of on my couch. Well, not sort of, like completely on my couch. And started having another intensely vivid dream where I was speaking perfectly coherently in another language, which I assume was Mandarin or Cantonese. And because I don't know either language, I can't say for sure. But I had no idea what was going on. So I went to the phone book and looked up the number for the RCI towers that are located in our fine town of Sackville here, or just on the outskirts of town, but I think still within town limits because it's before Outlock, but I don't know exactly where the boundary ends. And found the number and called the number there and got somebody on the other line. And I was very excited because I didn't expect that anything would really come about this, that I'd probably get an answering machine or something with a bunch of other options to use on your touch-tone phone, which was worrying me because I was using a rotary phone because that's all I had. So I had already set myself up for ultimate despair on that nothing was going to become of this phone call. But it was answered by a human, which was lovely. And I can't remember his name right now, but he was a wonderful person and seemed very willing to talk when I had told him that I was dreaming in another language that I didn't know. And I was wondering if it was the RCI towers had affected my dream. And he had asked where I live in town. So I described the location of I just gave him the street name actually. And he automatically knew that I lived right by a transformer station in town. So he had told me that I would most likely be experiencing this type of sensation because of my house proximity to the power station nearby, or transformer station rather, during my hypnagogic state of existence, which I had never heard of before, but he described to me it was just in between dreaming and awake, and that I would sort of maybe hear sounds or experience life through a certain Pink Floyd album. Well, he just said a Pink Floyd album. And I said, you know, what, pray tell, would be the Pink Floyd album? And he mentioned that it would be most akin to, say, the Ummagumma album, which is a lesser known album. Mostly it's just Pink Floyd fans that know the album, but so I was quite impressed with his knowledge of Pink Floyd and his ability to describe it to me in such a perfect way without any visual representation or any previous conversation we'd ever had based on music specifically. So that was a very nice thing. And he also told me that these occurrences happen in town to other people who give him similar phone calls. Like during a certain period when they flip, I think he was mentioning they reverse possibly the polarity of one of the towers, because I believe there's 13 of them across in their sort of web of attraction, I guess it's called. I don't know, or their net. It looks like a net, but I guess I'd call it a web of attraction. And I think he said it was one of them specifically that maybe it was, I don't know if it was a reversed polarity or a reversed something. But he said that this would quite possibly affect my dreams whenever they reversed that specific tower, I believe. He was a real nice guy.
My childhood was spent growing up underneath the shadow of the radio towers that we know as CBC or Canada Calling everywhere in the world.
And some of our first dates were out under those red lights.
And I lived always probably less than 200 yards from the building itself, which housed all of the paraphernalia which went with the radio station. There was enough power that at times some of the light bulbs which were not turned on, the circuits would glow. They wouldn't come on fully bright, but they glow with the power.
I was just sitting there, and all of a sudden this lamp sitting next to me started to light up. You know, it starts gradually, and it comes up, and as Wynn said, doesn't really come to a full light, but it glows. And I was there alone, and I'm like, this is not happening. And I was really freaked out. Wynn heard about it when he got home and laughed and said, oh, happens all the time, get used to it.
The towers were not as significant as the red lights. And the red lights were significant any time at night. Because no matter where you were, when you saw the red lights, you knew you were getting home. And that was, the red lights were always home to me. And as I said, I called them my mother's red lights. But they were always home. And you knew when you got there, you could see them, you were almost through your journey.
When we stepped outside onto that porched area, you could very clearly hear the voices of the people that were talking. It was, I think I remember it being voices at the time as opposed to music or other things.
We didn't ever really think that the cows were affected, although I can imagine at some point in time that they would have heard these sounds too, but they didn't complain.
I remember one day we were sitting in the lunchroom having lunch and looked outside, and there's this cow at the window. Great big cow. And we actually had, like, in our emergency contact numbers, there was one called stray cows. And it was a farmer that we called and said, "Hey man, your cow is up at our transmitter site again." I don't know how the heck the thing wandered that far, because our field is pretty big.
We had probably about 11 kilometers of road right on the site, and then maintaining the whole ground. So it was like, what, 500 and some acres?
We often got different kinds of animals there. We'd get foxes. In fact, behind the garage, some fox had set up a little nest underneath them. And so in the spring, we got to watch the development of these little cubs. And we'd point the security cameras at them and watch them play around. And in the winter, we'd see them out in the field chasing mice or something. One particular time, you'd see the fox walking along, and they do that thing where they jump up and then dive into the snow and maybe get a mouse that was under the snow. That was entertaining.
The transmitter is just a transducer that converts electrical energy into RF energy. The transmission line is there to match the transmitter to the antenna, so that the line has to be designed to take the energy that the transmitter produces and deliver it to the antenna. The transmitter is one thing, the transmission line is another, the antenna is the third component of that whole system.
Most of what you see, the physical antennas, were actually just support elements to keep them all lined up, because they have to be a certain distance apart, certain distance from the ground, and so on. So very little of it was actually antenna. It was mostly support. And the towers often had two different antennas slung between them. They are essentially stacks of dipoles, which are essentially the same as a pair of rabbit ears. So if you put rabbit ears one on top of the other, spaced apart, that would be one curtain. There was also a duplicate curtain for some of them, such that it acted as a reflector, and we could swap over to the other side and broadcast in the other direction completely. And they're stacked vertically to give us a signal that would sort of hug the horizon for a while and then shoot off into the sky and bounce off the ionosphere and then back down, bounce off the ocean, and so on, like a pinball machine.
There was 104 huts we had to maintain and take care of. Those are switch huts. They're the one who slewed the antennas, so we can go, say, if we want to shoot north or we want to shoot south, that's a slewing mechanism, which a slew is bringing it one way or the other.
None of the content that we broadcast, though, was produced here. It comes from Montreal, or so they say. At La Maison, they have the whole floor of studios up there. And we would receive the program and then broadcast it as shortwave. In addition, we also contracted with broadcasters of other countries to broadcast to North America. There's NHK out of Japan. There's some networks associated with Voice of America. There was a private station that was all 1 hour of techno music out of Belgium, I think. That was strange. Vatican Radio. China Radio International, Korea. Oh, we had lots of people.
The old Collins transmitters were there when I first got there. And the tuning cavities, there was 2 tuning cavities, one large, one small. The guys could sort of fit into the cavity to do repairs, but it was tight. So of course I was small, so I was usually elected. So I would sit on the edge of the cavity and kind of lay down, and then the guys would grab my legs and shove me right in there. And then I would just kind of shimmy up the pipe and clean up any arcing and fix any problems that were in there, just because I was little, so I fit. Soon after I started working there, my husband and I got married, and we decided that we were going to have some kids. So I got pregnant right away, actually. So I was there till I was, ready to be off work, and healthy delivery, no problems, nothing wrong with my boy. He's 21 now. And then also I have a daughter, and the same thing, I was pregnant while I was working there, and I think I worked there up until I was probably about 8 months pregnant with her. We used to have pretty good staff parties, I remember. We used to have a big lobster party every summer, and we would clean all of the equipment out of the garage, and then we had picnic tables, and everybody, it was like potluck, so everybody would bring food, and that was way back, and it was just great. You bring the kids, my kids thought it was great because there was all this stuff. I remember John would bring a trebuchet, like a homemade catapult, and he would launch things like tomatoes and small pumpkins, and the kids thought that was just fantastic.
Avant tout, c'est un site de la Société Radio-Canada, donc c'est Radio-Canada International. Mais les gens de Sackville m'ont dit souvent que ils ont marqué au cours des années qu'il y avait aussi une présence qui était militaire, en tout cas pas des chars d'assaut, mais que l'histoire veut qu'il y aurait eu une partie de l'établissement qui était hors limite. Do not enter, des lieux qui étaient top secrets, et que, encore là, les mythes du village disaient en sorte qu'il y avait une présence militaire américaine. Et donc, les gens ont toujours trouvé ça suspicieux. Je veux dire, les histoires que les gens ont entendues, j'allais dire fabriquées, ou en tout cas les mythes qui circulent, c'est que les gouvernements se faisaient des ententes bilatérales pour faire une écoute électronique de leurs citoyens, mais par voie de d'autres gouvernements. Donc, on s'échangeait l'information. Et les tours de Sackville, encore là, le mythe voudrait aurait joué un rôle dans cette écoute-là peut-être de citoyens ici aux États-Unis ou au Canada, et les gouvernements s'échangeaient l'information. Donc, les tours auraient ce rôle-là un peu ambigu. Autant c'était des voix pour émettre des valeurs de la démocratie. En même temps, les gens, dans le mythe urbain ou les mythes de la communauté de Sackville, il y a un côté un peu plus louche, un peu plus sombre, où on se dit, il me semble que j'ai vu des militaires sur le site, il me semble que j'ai vu des militaires entrer et sortir. Comment se fait-il que les avions ont un certain périmètre auquel ils ne peuvent pas circuler autour des tours? Présence de l'armée aussi. Et là, on parle de la guerre froide, juste pour être clair. Là. Donc, on parle des années où la tension était extrêmement élevée entre l'Est et l'Ouest. Ça fait en sorte que ces tours-là auraient peut-être un mandat plus nuancé que juste le côté qu'on voit plus publiquement, qui est celui d'émettre les voix de la démocratie. Peut-être qu'il y avait autre chose. Mais comme je le dis, les documents un jour sortiront peut-être, mais en ce moment, ça reste des histoires de la rue, des témoignages, la mythologie de Sackville.
Yeah, we can test that. We can shut that down.
Yeah, just to make sure that that's where the leak is, so we don't repeat our morning's exercise.
Yeah, so we'll go shut off down there, and then we'll see what's happening down here. We're going to have to get a hold of Dale so he can read down in the compressor room.
I'm not far from there now, so if you're close to shutting it down, I can read the flow from here.
So you want us just to shut it off at 119 Hut 2?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to shut it off down here. I'll let you know. I'm just walking over there now, about 30 seconds away.
Okay, I'm just a few seconds away from the meter as well. I'm just staying in the quiet area before I go and read it. So tell me when you want a reading. Yeah, but the total volume adds up. If we're losing 15 CFM towards A16, and we're losing 15 CFM towards A119.2, that's what we figure about 12 or so cubic feet per minute you're losing in both of the sections, and then the additional 12 or 15, we're losing little bits of it here and there. So we need to isolate, yes, we can shut down the rest of the field and just feed that section between the matrix and A119.2. That should tell us if we have a leak or not.
So he just shuts the rest of the field down and pumping up that one line.
Correct. We should be able to see how much you're losing just in that section if the rest of the field is shut down.
Did he shut everything else on and then pump with that one line?
No, I want to go all the way to Hut 2, all the way around the loop.
Okay, I'm going to open up Hut 2, because we're terminated here right now.
No, leave Hut 2 closed.
So you want to bring it around the other side?
Yes. What are you reading now, Dale?
Around 16.5.
Down a little bit here too. A little bit. We're about 16.5. Yeah, so almost double.
Each transmitter, when operating at full power, was capable of producing a peak RF power of 1 million watts onto the antenna if we operated at full power. Lots of times we did not. We operated at medium and low power. Medium power was 160,000 watts output. The low power was 100,000 watts. And we could not bring the transmitter any lower than 60,000 watts. So 60,000 watts is still a huge amount of power RF-wise. 250,000 watts, which is what the transmitter was rated at, but the RF envelope that it created is 1 million watts peak to peak. So when we had all 7 transmitters of the 250,000 watt transmitters operating and producing onto antennas, that was in the order of 7 million watts of RF power coming off that site. We had 3 lower power transmitters. They were max power at 100,000 watts, but they could create 400,000 watts and peak envelope power. So it's an additional 1.2 million watts. So there was a fair bit, 8.2 million watts of RF power that we were capable of producing out of that site. That's one hell of a microwave oven. I'll tell you could fry whatever you like real quick.
C'est intéressant aussi que je parlais avec quelqu'un, un géologue, puis lui dit, il dit, comme le niveau de la mer, puis le Nouveau-Brunswick, on est vraiment comme là, c'est vraiment exactement. On parlait de les marées qui vont peut-être changer éventuellement, puis monter, puis on serait parmi les premiers qui flotteraient. Parce qu'on est dans une situation, je pense, assez vulnérable en termes des marées et tout ça. Mais aussi que Sackville serait plus bas, comme en Louisiane, qui serait légèrement plus bas que le taux de la mer. Alors, ça nous met, je pense, dans une situation peut-être précaire ou peut-être un peu de menace, si tu veux, puisque la mer est si proche, puis elle pourrait vraiment nous swamper, comme qu'on dirait. Parce que c'est presque dans là qu'on vit, dans des swamps.
So I had this dream one night that I climbed to the top of one of the radio towers. And for some reason, I had to get out to the edge of the overhang. But once I was at the top, there was this giant spider blocking my way. And it was like human size. It was this massive human-sized spider standing between me and the edge of the overhang. And so I swung down underneath the overhang and I kind of climbed like the way a kid would climb on monkey bars in a playground to get out to the end. And I get out to the end of the overhang, and then there's this storm coming, and the sky's that kind of green and purple color before a big storm, and the winds are picking up, and there's lightning, and I need to get down to safety because I'm at the top of this radio tower, and there's a storm coming, and now this spider has actually blocked off the way that I came with this massive, sticky white web all over the bottom of the overhang. And so the storm's coming closer, and there's lightning and purple clouds, and the winds are picking up, and I have to get down. So I push the spider off of the tower. And as I watch it fall to the ground, it changes into a person. And I'm horrified as I watch this person fall from the top of a 400-foot radio tower. And I wake up before they hit the ground. I go back to sleep, and the next morning, I completely forgot about the dream. So the next day, once I'm up, I was going sound recording, and I parked my car on one of the public access roads in the fields behind the towers. And I get my tool belt and all my gear, and I hike through the marsh to the first tower, Tower C. And just as I'm about to clamp my microphone onto the tower, I see this massive spider. And I mean, not as big as the one in my dream, obviously, but still, it was pretty big. And I was just filled with this huge sense of relief. It was as if the spider that I pushed off the tower in my dream survived the fall, and everything was going to be okay. And so for the rest of the summer and the fall, every time I went out to the towers, I'd see that the base of each of the towers they were always covered with spider webs and these really big spiders, which I guess makes sense because with the high winds in the marsh, it's a perfect place to catch insects, and these webs were just filled with crickets and grasshoppers and moths and every type of bug you could imagine.
The spiders. They could be the size of your palm. They were big, and the building in the summertime was covered in them. Whenever I was going out anywhere that no one had gone through yet, I would take one of those sticks and I would just wave it in front of me and big circles, and if there was a spider or a web, I would find it before it found me.
We go down the transmission lines, which is 1/4-inch copper, solid 1/4-inch copper. We go down there and you'd have a burn because, say, a spider made a web and it could go south to ground, or, hate to say it, a bird would land on that wire and that thing come up to power, burn the feet right off them because it's solid power. And that's our most problem was out in the field was spiders, webs, and birds standing on the wire. And then, it's all right if the bird come down the wire. And but first thing, boys, when say if A-15 was coming up on 230, shooting to Europe, boom, like blow the feet right off it.
The sad little bird, landed on a transmission line that was live and burnt its feet off. So it had no legs, This bird lived for I don't know how many years, and we would see it all the time outside the kitchen window. And it would, I mean, at first you look at it and you're like, oh, it's just sitting right on the ground. Actually, it's because it had no legs. And it would flap a little bit to move itself from location to location. That's one of their favorite things to land on, right? You see them on high voltage lines all the time. But it's different when you're on a transmission line. It's not the same thing as a shielded line that's, sending power to your house. I think over the years there were even some wildlife groups that said we were a hazard. But I mean, we'd been there since 1945. That's when the first transmissions went out, right? We've had fires out there. Lightning strikes was a bad thing. If you knew you were getting some bad weather with potential for thunderstorms, we would get hit all the time with lightning because the towers like natural lightning rods, eh? And occasionally huts would get hit. And when they did, they usually burnt to the ground.
When you get a lightning strike, it'll go to ground. And everything's grounded pretty good out there. Of course, you're right out in the middle of nowhere, and the lightning hits, and I can remember I was lamping a tower. It was one of the Europeans. And anyway, I had my back to it, but there was a storm coming in. I never realized it. We didn't see it. So anyway, the head rigger, he called to me on the radio. He said, "Where are you at?" I said, "I'm at third tower." I said, "I'm just almost ready to head to the beacon." He said, "Get your butt out of that tower right now." I said, "Why?" He said, "Just get off that tower." And so, but it was coming in behind me, right? It was coming out of the south. Man, oh man, I started scampering down that tower. I even unhooked my rail and just free climbed it down. And when I got there, man, oh man, what a lightning strikes.
We moved there in approximately 1954.
Very late, the CBC started acquiring the land.
Yeah.
There was a house it's on the CBC side and down near the main highway. A house that we rented to people, and the CBC came along and bought them out, and so that eliminated that, got that house gone. You see, they were clearing it, and the same thing with the house that, we lived in. They bought that after we left there.
Was this not all as a result of the shocks that Mrs. Anderson was getting? That they realized that they could have problems with anybody who lived there, and so they started to clean out.
They started buying up.
They bought everything that was there.
As you say.
He lived out there
in that house.
In that house, and told stories about lights going on and off, and machines going on in the middle of the night.
There were 3 houses there, and they acquired them all.
Yes.
House is gone. Yes, it was quite close.
They would have been 60 or 70 yards away. In rural terms, they were, I think, quite close. Very close. In city terms, well, obviously they're a block or more away.
One time the energy was strong enough to start a fire in one of the garages. Either 2 nails were close together or 2 metal pieces, and it created an arc between that, and it just kept playing with that and started heating the wood and burned the wood around, and that set off a fire alarm, and we put it out. Way to go.
Ça nous fait sentir un peu comme des insectes, des petites mouches. Ça nous réduit, l'échelle humaine est réduite quand tu es à côté de ce gros objet-là. Tu penses, c'est un peu comme être à côté des baleines ou être à côté des choses énormes, puisque tu réalises comment pas gros qu'on est par rapport à d'autres choses qu'on voit.
There were a few accidents there. I know one guy in particular, he grounded out the transmitter, and there's a lot of power, there's a lot of current going through those transmitters. You have to wait. You can't just throw a ground switch and then go stick your hand in there, because it takes time for the current or the voltage to bleed off. And what happened was he didn't wait, and he put his hand in and he contacted a boiler that a very large capacitor was sitting in. It was still hot, and he was stuck. He couldn't remove his hand, and he was being electrocuted. Somebody else was there, and they hit him with a grounding stick. And when they did, it knocked him off. Anyway, he was out for a little while. He was okay in the end, but you could see the entrance where the current went in his hand, and it traveled through his body and come out the side of his boot. So it was his foot. So it went right through him. I was working with a partner one time. It was on the newer transmitters, and he had locked out the circuit breakers. And of course, I said, "Did you lock out the circuit breakers?" "Yeah, here's the keys." He hadn't locked out the 400-volt transformer. And I, of course, put my hand under there because I was taking out a driver tube. And when I did, I connected, and the force of the shock threw me out of the transmitter and into the wall behind me. And I remember my hand vibrated for months afterwards, drove me insane.
In 1976, I rented a house on Charlotte Street in Sackville with my then wife, Janet, and we were able to receive a radio from our refrigerator. Every time that we would open the refrigerator, we would get to see a radio, International's broadcast signal, whatever was going on, like the news in Arabic. And this continued on for quite some time, very mysteriously, but I understand it has happened to others.
When they turned their hot water tap on, they would get the sound of the radio coming out of their faucet, which I think is I think it's amazing.
So we rented that house there for a year. It was right in the Africa beam, so at certain times of the day, we'd get the full dose of radio frequency radiation. Now, I occupied the lower floor of the house, and there were people living upstairs, and they said they could hear the radio broadcasts coming through the kitchen sink. So that's an unusual phenomenon, but it really does happen, that the radio waves in the vertical pipes do cause some audio to come from the bowl of the sink, so they could hear the news and other broadcasts quite clearly.
I know that it was very frequent for it to be picked up and broadcast by our radiators. The sounds were not necessarily clear, but they were clearly voices. If I came home alone, which obviously happens from time to time, and you come in the house and you hear somebody talking and it sounds like they're down in the basement, what that meant is first you knew really what it was, but then I at least, when it happened to me, had to go down, walk through the basement, and generally walk through every room of the house and satisfy myself that there was no one there. But it did broadcast straight over the radiators many times.
We had just come in with big bags of groceries and stuff, and I took them down the hall to the kitchen to put them away. And as I did, I could hear sort of this funny moaning sound, which I didn't pay that much attention to. But when I started putting vegetables in the fridge, I realized it was somebody singing. And then when I shut the door, the singing stopped. So I thought, what is this? I experimented a few times, and I discovered that I could raise and lower the volume by opening and shutting the door. So I called Alec and said, "Come here, listen to this."
When we put our ears up quite close to the fridge, we realized that we were hearing the Metropolitan Opera from a rather unusual location. I think we just took it for granted. Oh, the fridge is singing again, you know. As soon as we figured out once what this was, then there was no need to question it anymore.
You open up the door, and of course you'd have your milk and bread and all this stuff, and you get radio signals from places like Austria or Russia or Africa even, and China. But obviously they were all spewing propaganda like we were, and you get these guys with playing music just like like a regular radio around here, radio station, except they would be talking about what's going on in Beijing or Moscow or Vienna. And it was really weird, of course. We open up this fridge and you're trying to look for what you're eating, or getting the weather forecasts from Vienna or something.
Really, I feel we took them in stride. They were doing things, but we didn't let them bother us.
The towers were never a bother to us.
No, there was never a feeling of being short of patience about it or anything like that. It was just a fact of life, living there. I didn't feel that they were encroaching on us in any way, but they were just a part of the atmosphere on the marsh.
There's an old fellow up in Medibanagia. My cousin used to talk to me, and he used to tell me a lot of these stories, and I just loved it. So whenever at night there I had to use a washroom, I had to wait till somebody went out, because I would just burst in to go out. When they'd go out, I'd go out.
And the reason for it is I was scared. Because we got stories of Meegum Wessu, we got stories of Skadegamuch. Skadegamuch, you ever walk and feel that somebody's following you?
I felt that way. I was filming the radio towers at night. I was camping out in the field right behind. There's the little river there, and I would tent out there for the last summer, to do these night shots. I was so scared, but I stayed all night. And afterwards, I figured maybe it was deer or something. I was like, well, there's other animals out here. Like when you feel like someone's watching you.
How long did you stay out there? How many days?
When I was camping, just. It's not that long. I would go out and then I would come back. So 2 days one time, 2 days another time.
Did you feel something was wrong out there?
The first time I went, I didn't. I was fine until actually about 2 a.m. I started hearing noises, and I guess it was just the wind making a wire hit the tower. The next time I went for 2 days, I was a little bit scared, but okay, I felt a bit of fear. And then the third time I went, felt like I wasn't safe, but I stayed anyway. And I went to do it a fourth time. And the fourth time, I couldn't even get out of the van. I climbed into the back seat and filmed out the window for a while, and I just felt like I'm not safe. I've got to go. So I drove along the highway, and there's the place where the highway turns and there's a guardrail. So I pulled the van off to the shoulder and I took all my stuff out, and for the rest of the film, all of my night shots I did there on where it's just the other side of that dam where the rocks go down to the river, and I would film the radio towers from that side. I just, I didn't know what it was, so then I just...
You know what it is? Let me tell you. I've heard the story over there, okay? It's not a good story. It's a story about a Mi'kmaq person, okay? And there are things that have happened over there. I was surprised that I listened to it, and then I just let it go, okay? I don't believe it, but the more you tell me, the more I think of that other story that I hear about what happened back then, okay? And it's coming back through you that I'm hearing it. I'm surprised because it's a ghost story. So, I mean, my father tells me when I was young about all the stories, and I wouldn't believe them. But as time goes on, I start believing because now I'm anybody starts it like you, I know it's a ghost story. I know it's something that's happened. It's a traveling area too, and right now it's a bird sanctuary, but it's a feeding area for First Nations too, because all the birds that fly through there and the other areas that are along that's what that is. But if you disturb it, something's going to happen. First Nations always thought that way. It's a ghost story, like.
So what was the ghost story?
The ghost story is you're one of them that have lived it, okay? You felt it.
Okay.
But you don't want to know what it is? It's Skadegamutuwe. No, it's...
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything about that.
It's Skadegamutuwe Gadi. It's a place of the spirit. There was a battle there a long time ago, either between two tribes with the Iroquois, or it could have been a battle with the English and the French a long time ago. So what has happened is the souls of the native people has not been released. There's a ceremony for that. And if the souls of that people haven't been released, it's still there. They still haunt the place.
I know there's something happening, because my father always believed there's something. They didn't like the tower there.
How come?
I don't know. He just talked about it, the towers being there. And he wondered why they put it in a bad place.
very often we'd be isolated in the winter, especially when you get the wind blowing snow across. We might be snowed in. I think I ended up spending like 30-some hours there at a stretch.
I never got snowed in. Some of the other people, like when they closed the marsh, we couldn't do anything in the field or anything like that. And so they'd send us home. But some people have been stuck there. That's why there was bunks, like 2 bunks.
Oh, snowed in one time. It was a weather warning, and I knew it was going to be a big storm. So I packed extra food, and I went in. And by the time I got to work, the storm was hitting, and I was stuck there. And after my shift, the storm was still going like crazy. The highway was shut now. No one was coming in because the highway going through the marsh was closed. And so I spent a second shift there. And so that's 24 hours. So now the storm is almost finished, but the marsh is still closed off and they're trying to clean it off. And so I'm spending my third shift there. So this is 36 hours before somebody came in to work.
But I mean, there's full facilities there, so there's a full kitchen. We've got fridge, stove, microwave, and we all had our own cupboards. So it was understood that if you got stuck there and you ran out of food, the other guys, you go through their cupboards looking for something to eat, and then you just replace it.
A lot of times, being out there on our own with no traffic nearby. There used to be windows facing the highway and the railway, but no, they covered that up with ventilation units and stuff. That you felt like you were kind of out on the ocean on your own. And here I am on board this ship, and I'm the night watch. I'm on the night watch, and I'm at the bridge, and I'm watching things happening, and all the antenna masts and towers were like masts of a ship, and you got the rigging. We just didn't have any sails, but there was rigging there. In fact, we even called the guys riggers. And with the hearing the different languages of both the Canadian productions and the foreign broadcasters, it was like different ports of calls. Except we didn't have to take weeks to get there. It was like every hour or so we'd be checking in. Okay, there's NHK, there's that Russian program, there's the, I don't know, what is that? Is that Portuguese? Yeah, I think it's Portuguese. Good. And so on. And it was like being on a large sailing ship, but almost all by yourself. And when something went wrong, you were there. You had to do something with it.
Like if we had, some of our towers are 450 feet, right? We had to lower the antenna down, fix it, and then put it back up. We had 2 big winches that we did that, so it would take us probably a day to rig, and then to drop it, fix whatever's broken, like the messenger or a broken insulator or whatever, and then another day to put it back up. So you work 2 days to fix a 3/8 bolt. But you can't do it up in the air, right? So we got to do it. They have it now that it's dropped down in the ground.
Icing could be dangerous because you'd get a lot of icing on the antennas themselves. So it wasn't really safe to be walking around out there, especially if you had a bit of a thaw. You could get chunks of ice that were big, and if they're falling from 300 feet, if that thing hits you, you're done. So, we knew which days that you couldn't really go out there into the field.
The ice that would accumulate on the lines, the transmission lines, or the antenna, would come in from the Bay of Fundy with the winds, okay? So the high humid air, and if the conditions, temperature were such, that the ice would start to accumulate on the lines, and they would accumulate quite fast. Over a period of a couple of hours, you could get a 2-inch accumulation around each wire. And what that does is it changes the dimension of the wire, and therefore changes the characteristic of the antenna or the transmission line. So a lot of times we had to wait till this. Usually these would happen in the morning, at the break of day and in the early morning, and then when the sun would come out, it would literally burn the ice off of the antenna or the lines. It would heat up the wires, and the wires would melt the ice, and then the hunks of ice would fall off. Sometimes from the antenna they would slide down one wire and hit an insulator on the way down, and it would break the insulator or cause damage on the antenna. It was not uncommon for us during icing season to experience blown capacitors on the output of the transmitters. Each capacitor was worth $12,000. So if we blew a capacitor just to be able to meet a 1-hour broadcast, which we would be paid $200, $400 for, it was a balancing act. You have to keep the power level as such so you don't damage anything. Sometimes we were successful and sometimes we were not. I preferred to just shut it down and wait for the sun to burn off the ice and let's take the hit of the lost transmission as opposed to $12,000 price tag on a capacitor.
One particular problem was with one of the Chinese broadcasts, which meant that people couldn't immediately identify it as our fault because there was no evidence that it was Canadian in origin. But it just happened that the Chinese broadcast was aimed through their house. I did one evening, I think it might have been Saturday night, I don't know. I got a phone call from one person who called to ask if we were broadcasting anything that would enable him to understand foreign languages. And he says, well, when I dream at night, I find that I'm hearing and talking in, I don't know, Chinese or Japanese or maybe Russian. I don't know what it is. Is there anything that you guys are doing that would do this to me? And I said, well, unlikely. Because I'd heard of people talking about tower busting. It's an interesting kind of, I don't know, subculture where people believe that cell towers and radio towers are exerting some kind of mind control over people. So I thought, oh dear, has he been reading up on this and thinking that's what we've got out here? And I said, well, tell you what though, do you have anything like clock radio or tape deck or stereo system by your bed? I said, well, yeah, I guess. And so, well, what might be happening is that you're getting some kind of spurious transmission going through and it's coming out the speaker system and you're hearing it at night and it might be that you're in hypnagogic state between waking and dreaming and where you're not sure what's real and what's not. And well, it might be, yeah, that might be what's going on. This is the most likely thing is, oh, well, thanks. Okay, bye. And yeah, that was the strangest call.
July 1996. Well, the island of the moon. Mare della nostalgia, pensate che vai e vieni. This is BBC News.
it was brutally cold, and my gloves, it was so cold that my gloves were sticking to the rungs of the ladder. And sometimes my fingers would be so cold and numb that I'd be fumbling with the safety lock to tie off when it was time to rest. And so when that would happen, the rigger would climb on the outside of the ladder and come up and help me with the safety lock. And every time he came into my line of vision and I could see him, I would have a flashback to that dream I had about the spider. And so all of a sudden, I became afraid that I was going to watch this man fall to his death. I just kept seeing that person falling from the top of the tower. And of course, I didn't tell him. I mean, it just seemed bad form to tell someone that you had a dream of watching a person fall off a tower when you're 100 feet up in the air. So I kept it to myself, and I think he could sense that I was afraid. And I think he probably thought that I was afraid of heights or afraid of falling. And I didn't dare tell him that I was afraid of witnessing. So I had picked the tallest tower. It was 433 feet tall. And at 120 feet, I was just paralyzed with this fear of watching this guy fall. And so at 120 feet, we stopped our ascent and climbed back down to the ground. And I felt like a total failure. I didn't even make it halfway up. So a few months later, I climbed a second tower, and it was Tower C, which was the one where I saw that first spider the morning after my dream. And that one was 250 feet tall, and I actually made it to the top. It was April, so it wasn't warm, but it was warmer than February. And it misted and rained a little bit at one point, but not too bad. I get up to the top, and the top platform, there was actually a crow's nest. And I don't mean like a crow's nest on a ship or the mast of a ship or a boat. It was actually a bird's nest, like a really big bird had a nest up there. And I get up next to that crow's nest, and the top of the tower is just over my head. The ladder stops. The guy climbing with me says, okay, well, now we'll get you outside of the tower and up on top of the beacon. And I just thought, well, my safety was attached to this ladder, and it's a safety rail. So I said, oh, that's not necessary. I've made it to the top. I'm good. And he just says, well, no, you haven't made it to the top. You're 20 feet from the top. But if you want to quit now, that's fine. But you're not at the top. So, of course, I wasn't about to quit this time. And so rearranged my safety clamps and disconnected from that ladder and climbed to the outside of the tower and up another ladder and made it to the top of that tower and sat next to the beacon. And I remember what struck me most was the silence. We were right next to the highway, and I couldn't hear the transport trucks or the trains. It was just so quiet.
sat up on the beacon. And my nose bag had a Pepsi. I'm gonna get emotional. It was one of my last climbs. And I sat up on the beacon and watched everything. And you were the last climber with me. I just looked at all the pastures and the highway going by, sun 3/4 of the way up. And I said, I'll never see this again. It was sad. It was sad. And I sat up there for probably 20 minutes. Just looking at the beacon and looking around. Said, this is the last one. But it's beautiful. Looking over the marsh, you see the isthmus, you can see everything.
And we can only guess, but I think between now and 2012 in London.
兴奋，这种交感神经兴奋的时候呢，就会使血压增高，血管收缩，血压。
Ici Radio-Canada Nord-Québec. Nous commençons maintenant nos émissions quotidiennes sur ondes courtes, diffusées à la fréquence 9625 kHz dès 6h58 heure normale de l'Est jusqu'à la fermeture à 1h04 du matin. Ces émissions vous parviennent de nos studios de Montréal, au Québec, et notre émetteur est situé à Sackville, au Nouveau-Brunswick.
So as we were driving off to see my parents, I still have the feeling of seeing those lights and the decision to get married, the decision to go and talk to my parents about it. And here's the lights from Sackville, where I'd spent 4 years at Mount A. So the world seemed all to come together at that point. I get weepy thinking of it. Isn't that strange? There's such a connection between all of those things. Isn't that strange? I just get such a kick out of it. No, when Jean and I saw those, the blazing red lights of the towers, as in the dark we came over the hill, and suddenly the car could speed up a little bit because it was going downhill. The lights of the towers were affirmation that we were getting near Moncton. The journey is almost over. When we get to Moncton, we'll tell my parents that we're going to get married. And from there on, the world will be in its place and all is well. So there was that sense of those towers almost providing a stamp of affirmation that we knew what we were up to, and we were going to get on about it. Yeah.
When my daughter was 17 in grade 12, we took the spring break and went up to sort of Ontario and into Maine, looking at a number of universities. So we were driving back very late, very, very late after having been on the road for like a week. And we were exhausted, and we came over the hill around 2 o'clock in the morning. And our daughter who's in the back seat, as soon as we came over the hill, she said, "Oh, I'm so glad to see those towers." She said, "That really is our backdrop, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess it really is." And I think that, you know, it's quite subtle in that we have this association with something that has always been there, and because it's always been there, you don't necessarily focus on it. But it's a very interesting thing in that I think that, you know, people have relationships with landscape. I think people have a huge relationship with landscape. I think in subtle ways, it's been a part of everyone who's lived here in Sackville, you know. You know, it's just they're quite iconic, you know, and they've become a real part of our lives.
Amazing how those inanimate things and places, we weave our personal story through all that stuff in a way that integrates the soft stuff and the hard stuff, the human, the inhuman, the technical, the personal. And that's been so much a part of, I think, what the CBC has been to me. And as I remember seeing those towers visually, but also particularly when I was in Kuala Lumpur and knowing where the source of that signal was, there was a feeling of all is well with the world, and I belong here.
When I drive across the marsh, and I've noticed this particularly the last couple of months, that the lights are starting to burn out. Watching, you know, those towers the lights starting to burn out on the towers, it's like watching somebody die.
Well, now we have come to a point in the show. We only have a few minutes left in this final program, and I kind of find myself in the incredible position of being one of the last voices to be broadcast on Canada's international radio. And over these past few years, it has been my extreme privilege to be able to work alongside some of the most dedicated and talented people I've ever known. But we're saying goodbye to teammates and colleagues, most of whom are reluctantly retiring or leaving the job they love to seek other employment, but every one of them with a strong sense of pride for a job extremely well done. I'm finding this very hard. For 67 years, RCI has been the country's voice to the world, broadcasting Canada's viewpoints and culture in several languages. Not without some rocky financial times, though. Over a decade ago, when our budget was about double what it is now, the accounting firm KPMG was hired to examine RCI, and they discovered to their surprise that in comparison it was probably the most efficient of international broadcasters. It currently costs Canadians about 34 cents a year for this international service. And I don't know about you, but personally I have more loose change than that rattling around in the ashtray of my car. But the RCI budget has now been cut by about 80%, with similar reduction on staff, equipment, and operations. And it's also being said that shortwave is a technology at the end of its life cycle, or quite simply obsolete. It's true that some countries have ceased shortwave and moved to the net, but countries like Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Australia, for example, have no intention of ending their international service. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty are going strong. The Voice of America is even going to open a new bureau in Burma. Indeed, the board overseeing those services said in its 2013 budget submission to the U.S. government that international broadcasting is among the most cost-effective initiatives within public diplomacy. Meanwhile, the Voice of Russia, with its 38 broadcast languages, has just this month opened a new office in London, saying it's a new opportunity to tell listeners about life in Russia and give Russian opinion on world matters. Other countries like China, North Korea, Cuba, amongst others, remain convinced of the strategic value of shortwave in spreading their message. In fact, this is an area where the Voice of Canada enjoyed great international respect and was relied upon by listeners worldwide for the fact our objectives in broadcasts and news services were to always be as balanced and unbiased as possible. And while there's no denying the importance of the internet, there's also no denying that it can be and is regularly blocked by authoritarian regimes. Shortwave broadcasts, on the other hand, almost always get through to people hungry for information. Radio has also always been an extremely inexpensive and highly portable, easily accessible to everyone around the world, no matter what their financial situation. But now I find myself, on behalf of all of us, saying goodbye to 67 years of radio, broadcasting stories of Canadian expertise and discoveries in medical fields and science, of technological innovation, business opportunities and practices, both good and bad, Canadian politics and policies, Canadian expert opinion and analysis of domestic and world affairs, and of course wonderful Canadian artists and culture. And most sadly, goodbye also to you, my radio friends, with whom we have shared so many stories. I have absolutely loved being your host, welcoming you to the link every day for these past many years. It's a privilege I have been thankful for every single day. Your many letters expressing your thanks for bringing you Canadian stories and artists you have not heard about elsewhere, and also expressing shock and dismay at the ending of the show, have truly warmed all our hearts. And thanks to all of you who have also written to the CBC to tell them how much you appreciate the show and the kinds of Canadian stories we cover. We do remain hopeful that a mere $10 million may quickly be found to save RCI, but now on behalf of all of us, let me express to you a most sincere thank you for our small but highly dedicated team. And so, for all of us, thank you so much, and goodbye.